So I would like to welcome everyone here today. This is the Master of Educational Technology Anti-Racism Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Carrie Ewert, and I am faculty for the Master of Educational Technology program, what we call MET, at UBC. I'm the co-designer of this series with former interim MET director, and I think I see her here, Dr. Samia Khan, and current EDIDA and Community Outreach Coordinator for MET. So I have with me MET's GAA student, Helena Wright, who you'll see puts a lot of links in and kind of navigates the chat area for us. And then I also have our EDIDA Work Learn student, Tamika Fisher, who assists with all of the anti-racism speaker series and EDIDA resource creation items. And I thank her for being here as well. So before we begin, we'll just go to the next slide, please, Helena. I would like to recognize and honor the enduring presence of the Coast Salish people, including the territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, on the traditional and ancestral and unceded territory of UBC's Point Grey, Vancouver campus of the Musqueam people. I would like to acknowledge the history of violence and wrongdoings inflicted upon these Indigenous communities and many others throughout history as a result of colonialism and settler colonialization. So as an uninvited settler to this beautiful land, it is my responsibility to listen, to learn, to engage in a meaningful action to address the ongoing impacts of colonization and to support the reclamation and revitalization of Indigenous ways of learning, knowing, and doing. So at MET, we believe that through collaboration, through education, and commitment to change, we can work towards a more just and equitable future. Today, I was really fortunate to have been in a meeting earlier and learned of the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at UBC, and I didn't know that it had existed here. There are so many resources and teachings and critical dialogue that address colonial impacts of residential schools and different policies enforced by the Canadian government and enforced on Indigenous people. So I plan on visiting that center as a means to continue my learning and growth as an uninvited settler on this land and examine ways that I can continue to engage in that reconciliation process in the work that I do here at MET as a faculty member, as well as the coordinator for EDIDA. So I invite all of our audience here today to join us in this journey of understanding and together contribute to positive change and healing. So we ask that everyone take a moment to really think and focus your thoughts and actions on both recognizing and appreciating the territory on which you work, play, and live, and to the original caretakers of this land. And please, if you feel free to, in the chat area, to write your own territorial acknowledgement if you wish. Tamika? Oh, you're muted, Tamika.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Master of Educational Technology, which we call MET program, is a graduate program in the Faculty of Education at UBC that educates professionals on the use and impact of digital learning technologies.
Now, the purpose of this speaker series, as it has been for the last 3 years, is to acknowledge the commitment that every individual has to inclusivity and to addressing systemic racism. With the focus on anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, and anti-people of color racism, this series seeks to identify the responsibility educators and leaders have to facilitating and supporting anti-racist approaches and strategies for truth, redress, and reconciliation within their practice, and to enhance and transform learning environments and learning cultures. With a specific directive being digital technologies, presenters such as our incredible Dr. Bryan Brayboy will discuss Indigenous ways of learning, knowing, and doing, and racism through the tools and supporting reconciliation process for changing dynamics within this digital age.
As a result, at MET, we are committed to a follow-up to each presentation of the speaker series with a call to action challenge. We invite all attendees to make one change this month and to share it with us as a next step to these presentations to eradicate racism through reconciliation, allyship, and community building, education, and through the use of educational technologies. This call to action provides you the opportunity as an attendee of this speaker series to build on the anti-racist content from the presentation and steps to making change.
We'll be using the tool Slido, which I think, Helena, if you can put it in to the chat area again, as some people have just joined us. It's a way for you to ask questions throughout the presentation that you can share, and we will share with Dr. Brayboy at the end of the presentation. He'll be speaking for about 45 minutes and then addressing those questions at the end. So at this moment, I am extremely honored and privileged to introduce you to, and this is the most fabulous name, Bryan McKinley Jones Brayboy Lumbee. Did I say that right? Correctly? Perfect. Dr. Brayboy is a dean of Northwestern University School of Education and Social Policy and the Carlos Montezuma, I believe, professor of education and social policy. He is a member of the National Academy of Education and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. And Bryan Brayboy's research focuses on intersecting knowledge systems that illuminate the ways that institutional structures simultaneously hinder and enable the success of underserved students, staff, and faculty. His research also explores the ways that culture and cultural practices mediate and support Indigenous student learning, community self-determination, and tribal nation building. In this talk today, Dr. Bryan Brayboy will provide an overview of how he thinks about Indigenous knowledge systems and their connections to Indigenous education. Dr. Brayboy will continue what he means and talk about what he means by knowledge systems and what makes them Indigenous. The talk will also consider ways to help Indigenous knowledge systems inform pedagogy. Welcome, Dr. Brayboy. We're so honored to have you here today with us. And I know the audience is extremely eager for me to stop talking and for you to be able to take over. So I welcome you today here. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. I would just say to you that UBC's School of Education is my second favorite school of education. I have to say that because I might have some colleagues here from CESP, the School of Education and Social Policy, which I love and adore. And so I'm really glad to be with you. Thank you for the warm introduction. I've just put myself on a timer. It'll go off at 30 minutes and then I will try to start to move things down. So, or wind things down, I should say. I'm gonna speak from a PowerPoint. I'm hoping you all can see this. Can someone give me a thumbs up if they can see my PowerPoint?
We can see it perfectly.
Thank you. So I'm really grateful for the invitation. And as I said, I have really, really warm feelings for UBC and the amazing work that y'all are doing, including the work that you're doing at Met. As you mentioned, my name is Bryan McKinley Jones Brayboy. I am the son of Bobby Dean Brayboy. He is the son of Eva Harris Brayboy and Tecumseh Bryan Brayboy. The second, I'm also the son of Mary Elizabeth Jones Brayboy, and she was the daughter of Rosebell McMillan Jones and Zelma Sampson Jones and McKinley Jones Sr. So some people will sometimes say to me, like, what's with all of the names? And I'm named after my grandfathers. My parents had this deal where if they had girls, my mom would name them. If they had boys, my father would name them. And much to my mother's chagrin, they had three boys. And so McKinley Jones Sr. is my maternal grandfather, and Tecumseh Bryan Brayboy II is my paternal grandfather. I'm coming to you from my office in Evanston, which is the land of the peoples of the three fires, Odawa, Menominee, and Potawatomi. Mentioned, I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe, and more specifically from this community called Prospect, which is a very small community and often thought of as one of the more traditional communities in our amongst our tribe. I will call your attention. This is fascinating because when I was growing up, this sign would say, "Welcome to Prospect Community, population 123, cradle of Indian country." It is now, and if you look closely, there are bullet holes in it, but now it says, "Welcome to Prospect Community, cradle of Indian prosperity." established 1879, we're going to come back to this idea of establishment and the fact that my community has decided to say that we are established in 1879 when we walked out of the river many, many, many years ago. It's a fascinating thing. And then this is a picture of me. I don't know if I'm in second or third grade here, but I like, this is a place that made me. My parents obviously made me as well. My mom made that shirt. I remember we did not have much money. I keep waiting for paisleys, the big paisleys and big collars to come back into style. This is my mom with our oldest son, Quana. And then that's my dad with our two sons many years ago. I am my parents' son and my grandparents' grandson and so on and so forth. But I'm also a father, which becomes a really important part of my identity. And our boys are I mean, this is the best and the hardest job I've ever had, to be a father. That's Quana on the left. He is a senior at Yale, where he plays soccer. Um, and he's just, this is from earlier this fall when he scored a goal against their arch nemesis. With him on the right is our younger son, Ely, who's a student, a computer science student at Brown in Providence, Rhode Island. So I am a son and grandson. I am a father. I am a product of the place that birthed me. So I'm going to jump into this. I mean, I'm thinking about it, it's an interesting thing for me to talk about racism. Much of my career has been about racism and anti-racism, and I'm taking in some ways a turn. Rather than a turn away from that conversation, a turn towards something that I think is really important for us to address larger questions about structural and systemic forms of oppression. I feel like sometimes we linger in those places, and I wonder what we might move toward. And so I want to just sort of wonder with you all about how we might reimagine our classrooms in and through a lens of knowledge systems and Indigenous knowledge systems. You all should know I don't write my talks. I write a PowerPoint and then I just sort of talk from them. And so I never exactly know what I'm going to say unless the PowerPoint kind of pulls me back. But we can't really think about Indigenous students or Indigenous education without actually thinking about their and our connections to the federal government. And this is true in the US, and it's certainly true in Canada. I am likely going to make some mistakes about how I talk about Canada here. I ask your forbearance and your forgiveness, and I also hopefully it will be a serve as a pedagogical tool for you later to both correct me, but also correct the record when I do that. But our relationships between who we are as Indigenous peoples and our federal governments are just intertwined in really powerful ways. For First Nations peoples in Canada, the Indian Act of 1879 is just such a profound document as you go through it. It does everything from recognizing lands and caretakers of lands to how you discipline people for misbehaving, to what happens with intoxicants or alcohol and so on and so forth. And so it's a governing document in some ways that kind of sets rules and regulations, but also in the process really gets at the importance of the relationship between First Nations peoples and Canada. The Enfranchisement Act is a fascinating document about how you enfranchise people, First Nations people, into a nation state. And then this Gradual Civilization Act of 1857. So imagine that you've got this act that says we're going to gradually civilize you in this. And First Nations peoples and the Crown become a really interesting thing, but it begins to set the terms of the debate in really important ways that I just think we all should be paying attention to. But it doesn't start in 1879 or 1869 or even 1857. It starts well before that. Um, there is a naming here when you begin to set the relationship the way the federal government has in Canada with First Nations peoples. It moves conversations to really recognizing Indigenous peoples, First Nations peoples as having a political status. And then the commitments of the federal government to tribal nations and their citizens. Even as this document in 1879 begins to outline who constitutes citizens in very particular sorts of ways. But we just can't talk about First Nations education without really understanding these complexities. And I will just say to you that both in the US and in Canada, there's an exchange and use for lands that led to a series of promises that become really important in this. And there's a real question. Canada always seems like ethically and morally it's a much better place than the US in terms of how it deals with these issues. I will let you all decide if whether or not my perspective as someone from the outside actually makes sense. But I want to actually talk with you and frame this around the 4 T's. Which for me are a really good way for us to orient the way we think about Indigenous education and Indigenous peoples and relationships to a federal government. So tribal sovereignty for me is a fairly basic thing in lots of ways that isn't actually so basic at all. It's this inherent right of peoples to engage in the process of creating futures of our own making. And so like this becomes a really important thing because it's seen for me, it's the inherent right. It isn't a right that is given through signing of treaties, through some sort of act by Canada, which is often what will happen is we'll say, oh, well, this is a thing because we signed these acts between Canada and First Nations peoples. I think it's really important for me to say, and I'm really building here on the work of people like Joanne Barker and Tyegi Alfred and Jeff Corntassel and others, Heidi Stark, who've made really compelling arguments that suggest it isn't Canada who gave First Nations people sovereignty. It's the opposite. It is First Nations peoples that gave Canada sovereignty. And the same is true in the US. If you look at early treaties, and we'll look at one in a second, there is a pretty clear sense of asking for peace, asking for assistance, asking for help, recognizing people and their ownerships of land. So there's these fledgling countries that actually gain their sense of being sovereign from tribal nations and not the other way around. There are these treaties. This is the second T that are agreements between equals. You can see that this is affirmed in the Section 35 of the Constitution Act from 1982. And in Canada, as I understand it, there are 70 treaties between 1701 and in 1923 that get signed and ratified. This is fascinating because here's one from 1752, so about 50 years into this, and I've bolded some words that I think are really, really important here because what's interesting is this is a treaty that crosses into what's now the U.S. But wasn't then, and also thinks about what's happening in places in the eastern part of your amazing and beautiful country. But think about what this says in it in this in terms of the terms of the treaty itself. Shall be, they're talking now about this ratified document, shall be and are hereby from this time forward renewed, reiterated, and forever confirmed by them and their tribe. This is an agreement that lasts in perpetuity. It isn't a thing that goes away. So while it's almost 300 years old, it's 275 years old at this point, there's nothing in here that says there's an expiration date on it. And this is the important thing about treaties, that they last in perpetuity. Look at this next bullet. Said Indians shall have all favor, friendships, and protection shown them from His Majesty's government. So there's a relationship that gets built in the midst of this. And these are all excerpts from this treaty. Think about what this does is it recognizes in the moment and moving forward that tribal peoples, that tribe of Indians have free liberty of hunting and fishing as usual, right? That's not confined to some reserve, by the way. It's not confined to anything. It's as usual. So where is it that peoples were fishing and hunting, and those rights will continue in perpetuity? And then there's some agreements made and some commitments made by the government itself here in terms of saying you'll get bread, flour, and other provisions that can be procured. And every year in October, if you've sort of honored your part of this, you'll get blankets, tobacco, and some things so that you can continue to do your work. This is about relationships. It is about setting up the conditions for a particular set of relationships. That's what treaties do. In the midst of this, it creates this third T called trust, or the recognition of this relationship between tribal nations and the Canadian government. And it's all of the stuff that then gets agreed to legislatively and executively and so on and so forth. But it's also tied to lands. And that becomes a really important part of this, whether those lands are ceded or unceded lands. These treaties are really connected to those places, which is the fourth T. Sometimes this is reserved, sometimes it's not. And so these four T's, tribal sovereignty, treaties, trust, and territory, become really important framing mechanisms for how I think about Indigenous education. What's the purpose of First Nations education? Kind of from the start, it has really been intended to both civilize and assimilate, and in some ways to control peoples. That becomes really, really important in terms of what's our work as educators in this process. So what is the role of schooling? Some will argue in the 21st century, in the 20th and 21st century, some people will say it's about preparing young people to enter into the workforce and into the workplace. So we're preparing people to be able to go work. Others will argue that it's really preparing children for the world in which they are going to live. If you think about the moment we are in 2024 and how fundamentally different the world is going to look in 35 and 40 and 50 years, children who are being born now, the world around them is going to be so fundamentally different physically. I'm not even sure how we prepare them to live in a world where there are weather events that are dangerous and really created by the kinds of actions that we are engaged in now. And so it becomes a really interesting thing to be able to prepare children for a world that physically and geographically would stay the same over the course of their lifetime. And now I'm not entirely sure that's true. So we should think about schooling. But what do we actually learn? What do our children learn in schools? There's stuff that we get prescribed through curriculum. We learn how to make friends or not. We socialize. We often schools help people learn to be good citizens. It is a place where we begin to highlight difference. Schools do that, right? And then they categorize and they sort. They see individuals. So think about it. You've got this young school. You've got these young children in school, and you say, okay, boys on this side, girls on this side, shortest in the front, tallest in the back. Hurry up, children. Let's go. Brian, stop doing that. Stop playing with that. Let's get into line. Brian, stop. I told you, keep your hands to yourself. And what is the first thing after we learn how to read and to write, what is the first thing we learn to write? We learn how to write our names. And then we get penalized if our names aren't on some assignment for us to get credit for. And so there is some sense here that we teach people, what schools do is they teach people to see difference, to categorize and sort, to become individuals tied to specific names. Right? When I introduced myself and my name earlier, it's a tie to a genealogy. It isn't about me. I mean, my biography is about that. But this is a fundamentally different thing. And what schools do is they reinforce zero-sum thinking about how we engage the world. For someone to succeed, someone else in some ways needs to fail. For someone to be in the 90th percentile, someone needs to be in the 10th percentile. And so you see what we do is we start to learn who are the smart kids, who are the capable kids. We start to sort them out. We pull them out. We put them in particular kinds of programs to begin to remediate them. So schools have this powerful impact on not just on how we see ourselves, but how we see others. And it does a whole bunch of other stuff in the process. So I want to ask, like, given what I've just said, what might it look like for us to reimagine what we teach and what our students learn? How might we reimagine our classrooms? Schools, for me, can be and should be sites of possibility rather than sites of foreclosure. That previous model in a zero-sum game in some ways starts to foreclose young people's futures. I want to read to you there's this great policy paper, white paper, that was published in 1972, authored by the National Indian Brotherhood or Assembly of First Nations in Canada. And on page 3, here's part of what the authors of that document say about what education is. It's a preparation for total living. It's a means of free choice of where to live and work, and it's a means of enabling us to participate fully in our own social, economic, political, and educational advancement. Like, what would it look like for us to reimagine schools and their purposes away from sorting to places of possibility? This is this beautiful document authored in 1972 for Canada to say, for First Nations of peoples, here are the things we might begin to think about and the demands that get made. Okay, so I'm supposed to be talking about knowledge systems, I suppose, and I should probably get to that. Here's what I think is important about them and what knowledge systems do, which is really to create these possibilities that I've been talking about and to think about the ecologies of our classroom in this conceptual framework of knowledge systems. So they provide us a way to think about that ecology as teachers, as students, as a place and a curriculum, the school and the community, educators more broadly. And so it's the intersections of these relationships and chemistries are really a great way to think about knowledge systems. But I would also say to you, it's a great way for us to think about our classrooms. I sometimes worry that we are aiming to change entire schools in a singular moment, or entire school districts, or an entire system of schooling. And while I think that's really admirable and important, what I also know is that what we can do is change our classrooms. This is fundamentally local work that is tied to larger work. And if we're going to begin to ameliorate some of the ways in which racism and systemic biases and problems show up in our classrooms, this is a radically local project with big global kinds of implications. So what is this knowledge system? And why should we even care? They are, for me, they're tools that help us think about how knowledge gets circulated and recirculated and how it gets defined. Think about what happens with this. It crosses over, these knowledge systems cross over lots of context. And often what it does is it maintains the status quo of our schools or our structures. Who succeeds, who doesn't, who ends up in some sort of remedial education, who ends up in some sort of gifted education, who goes off to universities, how do we decide which universities they get to go to, who has access to become a surgeon or a doctor or some other kind of thing, who has the options to be a stay-at-home mom or dad, or so on and so forth. There ends up being these patterns, and it's a status quo. Knowledge systems are like the air we breathe. They're often invisible. And sometimes they're great, right? I mean, if we breathe, it's part of what feeds us and allows us to continue to live. but if it's polluted, it isn't. And so it's not always great in terms of we do it. But so you all at this point must be going like, what is his deal and why won't he define this thing for us? And if you're in that place, like I get it, I think it's really important. But part of what I would say to you is that I've been talking about knowledge systems. And I've been circling around them, and I've been thinking about and trying to say to you that they're embedded in our schools. But what I haven't done is say to you, like, what are they systemically and systematically, and how might we begin to think about them? And it's an interesting thing when we begin to say, like, what is this thing, that if we don't have it kind of laid out in front of us, um, there are moments, and for me as well, where I am frustrated by that. So I'm at slide 20, and I still haven't even defined for you what this thing is. Except I feel like I have actually done that. So let me cave to peer pressure here and say to you, okay, so here's how I think about knowledge systems. There are these 5 philosophical components of this that I think comprise knowledge systems, and I'm going to take them separately, but I think it's important to really understand that they overlap in really powerful ways, and for us to think about one of them without the other 4 ends up just giving us an incomplete picture, and we can't talk about knowledge systems with all 5 of these. There are people out there that will argue with me about what these are. You may argue with me about this, or you may think that there's 4, you may think that there's 8. All fair. Like, I'm just presenting you the way I think about knowledge systems and why I think they're important. So epistemology is really, how do we think about ways of knowing? Philosophers tend to take up epistemology in some really interesting ways in terms of their questions that they're asking. I tend to really say, like, here's the question: how do we come to, or questions, how do we come to know what we know, and what is knowledge? Like, fundamentally, what is it? So it resides in our brains. Sometimes it's on paper, it's on the internet, it's in nature, it's embedded in our bodies. But part of what I would say to you is that knowledge is ubiquitous. Schools sometimes limit it to what shows up in a notebook, or in another book. But part of what I would say to you and suggest to you, that if we're going to talk about knowledge systems, we have to think about knowledge itself and the epistemological questions as being ubiquitous, that is, everywhere. Ontology is really, how do we think about our ways of being? So it's ways of knowing for epistemology, it's ways of being for ontology, and we ask, like, how do we be? What are our realities, and what are the ways in which we are, becomes really important. So philosophers will sort of say, are we sentient beings? Are we conscious and awake beings, as a question that ontologists might ask? What I think is important about our realities is they move and they migrate and they shift all the time. They are often tied to a place. So some of us travel from one place to the other, and our realities and our being shifts in some ways, because it's not something that we make by ourselves. It is co-constructed with place, it's co-constructed with peoples, it's co-constructed with timing, and context becomes really important in all of this work. But knowing and being are really deeply connected. People who talk about ways of knowing without talking about ways of being confuse me a bit, as if you can separate those 2 things out. And like knowing, for me, being is really is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Okay, pedagogy. So you all have these unbelievable pedagogues at UBC, maybe the best on the planet. I think, arguably. And the important thing about this, and you all know this already, is that some people think about pedagogy as how we teach, but it's actually fundamentally, and you can look at this from your own faculty and own experts there, that it's fundamentally about how do we think about the combined processes of both teaching and learning. And if you're doing technology, like, you can work to build something where you're teaching someone, but if you do it devoid of how people learn through particular kinds and means of technologies or some other thing, then you're not really doing pedagogical work, you're doing teaching work. which is a fine thing to do, but it's not pedagogical. And so like, for me, we ask this question: how do we think about the processes, the interconnected processes of teaching and learning, and to what end? And what is it that does this? So stories teach, they help us teach and they help us learn. So do places. These are in motion. And so for me, pedagogy itself is not a noun, it's a verb. We engage in the process of pedagogy. We engage in pedagogical processes as we do this. And again, they are intimately tied to how we think about knowledge and how we think about realities. If we're going to be really phenomenal and extraordinary pedagogues, and we think about both the teaching and the learning piece of this, then we have to be able to understand what it is people bring with them and how they think about it. And for me, this is such a beautiful intersection. And speaking of beauty, we can talk about axiology. So philosophers tend to think about axiology as this as an aesthetic, the way we think about like what is beautiful. I have come to really ask this question about values. What do we value, and what do we think is good, true, right, and beautiful? This is really, for me, the axiological piece is what undergirds our system. The ways of knowing, the ways of being, how we think about teaching and learning sit on top of these values about what we are. Like, what is it that we value? Think about what we think of as being really important in schools. Like, did you get through the curriculum? Did they pass the tests? Is there an assessment that's appropriate that's there? And did they meet all of the rubrics that are in place? That says a lot about what we value. And we're not asking about, did they go through the process of learning in particular ways, or are they learning very specific kinds of things for our students? So what are our values? They tend to guide how we think about pedagogical implementations and how we think about the realities and the beings of our students, but also then the knowledge, because we choose what to teach and what not to teach. I think it's really important to note here that for me, values are lived, and that's not an unimportant concept. And so they are verbs, and they are also ubiquitous. And then finally is cosmology. Now, traditionally, it's astrophysics thought about this, physicists who've thought about this as the origin of the world. Just think about the original slide that I put up there. About Prospect. Welcome to Prospect Community, cradle of Indian prosperity, established 1879. There are these temporal pieces of cosmology, but really, for me, this is about how do we think about the origins. And so we might ask, like, what is the origin? And there are genealogical concerns here. I was moved by the land statement earlier because it gets at the genealogy of who has been on and continues to be on, and guardians and rightful holders of lands. Like, that's a genealogical thing, but ideas are also genealogical. The ways of our realities are genealogical. We learn them from other people. If you think about what's happened in residential schools in Canada, if you think about what's happened in boarding schools in the US, it's created all of these interesting genealogical disconnects, because you've got young children who go off. Like, the process of governments to educate and school us is to rip us from our families, send us off to these schools with the idea that somehow they'll civilize us and make us better. But think about what it does to a continuation of our learnings, of our values, of our knowledge, of our ways of being in all of this. And then what does it mean for us to be parents and to be teachers if all of a sudden we go from a community that is focused on some commitments to the communal, and then we say you're going to be in this regimented military-like style where you're individuals? It's disruptive in that way. So I think it's important for us to be mindful of the genealogy of where do our ideas come from. When we teach, how do we teach? Do we teach in the ways we've always taught? I have said, and it has gotten me in a little bit of trouble in the past. I've really suggested that what we need are teachers who hated school. Because often what we do is we have people who are really good in school, really good in school, really good in school, and then they become teachers. And then they tend to teach in the ways in which they were taught. Well, what happens if you hated that system? How might you reimagine and reconstruct it? And I'm not saying all the teachers should do this, but what would it look like if there was room for people who wanted to disrupt that the origin or the continuation of the origin of schooling processes, particularly if it's rooted in things like assimilation and colonization. So here are all the questions together, and I'm happy to share this PowerPoint with you if it's useful. If not, I can't even tell if y'all are sleeping at this point, if you're still awake. But taken together, these become really important for how I think about teaching, how I think about the future of Indigenous education, how I think about how we might begin to move toward being anti-racist and anti-colonial in the work that we do, because we start to question things like, what is knowledge? What are our realities? Can we see other people's realities? How do we help people both teach and learn? How do I think about my teaching, and how do I think about that in relation to my learning? What is it that I value, and how do I know? How do I see my values, and how do I live, and how do I do them? And how do we think about the origin? And we might continue that thread, that temporal thread, through what do I think about eschatology, or the eschatological implications of this, that is the ends of time. So this gets us to both the past, and it helps us think about the future if we think about eschatology as another temporal component tied to cosmology in terms of where all of this is going. Okay, so I've been talking for about 36 minutes, and I'm going to try to wind this down a little bit over the next few minutes, maybe more than few. But here's what I would say about how I think about Indigenous knowledge systems. So I've given you a broad sense about what knowledge systems are, which is one part of Indigenous knowledge systems, but that's a philosophical piece, but there are also these other truisms that I think are really important. Indigenous knowledge systems are empirical. Like, sometimes we think about empirical as scientific, and I think that's a good way for us to think about it, but it's also about how do we think about data collection and observations. We have done this since time immemorial in terms of collected data. I'm always struck when I meet young Indigenous peoples, and they're like, I'm not a scientist. And I'm like, well, no one's ever been a scientist. And I'm like, let's talk about this so that we can actually, what does it mean? And so there's something really important about understanding patterns over time. This has often been tied to food and water and ways of survival, but you start to notice over periods of time, when are fish coming? When are other games coming? When is it good to plant so that a late freeze won't do something? How do we begin to feed ourselves? It's kind of the start of this, but it's also like, how do we understand if people are going to do the things that we think they might do? It's through long periods of observation. Sometimes, by the way, this is brutal. So you're walking along, and Tommy eats something and then he dies. And so the empirical nature is, there's an observation. If you eat that, you'll die. Or someone will eat something, and then the back of their mouth, they might eat eucalyptus, and the back of their mouth is numb. And they're like, oh, if I have a toothache, I can eat eucalyptus. So the verb piece of this continues both through observations, but also by doing stuff. And this gets to the second piece of this. Like, our knowledges are sensual. They live in and through senses and through multi-sensorial ways of doing this. Think about rain. When do you know it's going to rain? Like, sometimes you see the rain, sometimes you feel it. How many of us smell it before it comes? How many of us have older people in the community who have something and they're like, my knee hurts, it's going to rain? So we know things sometimes in and through our senses, and it's not just a book thing, it's a lived thing. It's embodied, which I'll say more about later, but we live these through our senses. they're cumulative. I am the son of a grandmother who lived in our grandson of a grandmother who lived in our house, who was my mom's mom, who was a teacher, who taught me how to read. Grandma Zell taught me how to read. And so, but she also taught me all of these other things, which she learned from her grandmother, who learned from her grandmother, who learned from her grandmother, and so on and so forth. And so there's a long line. This is a genealogical connection to this about how we understand things over periods of time. Sometimes people think that knowledge is like a new thing. Well, sometimes there's new knowledge that gets created, but there's also a whole bunch of knowledge that is cumulative, that spans generations, that becomes a really important thing. Through all of the ways in which we encounter tragedy and heartbreak and mess ups, and fun, humor is a really huge part of what we do. There's this young man that I know who went out the first time with a boat out on the ocean, and it was a gasoline engine, and he stopped to fill it up, being kind of a responsible person. He put diesel in it, which then led to all kinds of problems, including having to clean out the engine and dump all of the diesel. And that was 20 years ago. And when you walk around the community, you can imagine what his nickname is, Diesel. That's the humor part of it. And one of the worst moments for him as a young person in his life is to really tie humor to this, to both poke fun, but to also say, okay, so what do we do with this? Knowledge systems and knowledge itself is located in place. We learn in and through place. Like, you can start to imagine now what you do with this in your own classrooms, in your own classroom practices, and how you might engage in pedagogical practices tied to knowledge and commitments to understanding people's realities, but also thinking about the values that undergird this, but they are tied to place. It's one of the reasons why place becomes so important for many Indigenous peoples. I've already gone through the lived and embodied pieces of this, but all of this is really about, like, knowledge gets lived, our systems get lived, our values and our realities and our origins are all lived. They aren't nouns. I mean, there are nouns involved, but the processes become really important in all of them. And then I've been talking here about relationships. And so if I am in relationship with you, then I am in some ways necessarily responsible for and to you. And I can be in relationship with another person. I can be in relationship with a place. I can be in relationship with knowledge. But if I am in relationship with it, creates a real sense of responsibility. There becomes then, we remove the individual from this and we think about the collective, because we are there. And part of what this leads to is a real sense of reciprocity. So we can think about this. If I'm in relationship to a place and I find out there are gold or diamonds in that place, or there's oil or gas in that place, like, if I'm responsible to it, am I going to extract those things out of the ground? Or am I going to imagine it differently? Lands, for example, in this case, they feed us, but they can also kill us if we aren't really mindful about those relationships. And there's a reciprocal piece of this. I care for lands and they care for me, and vice versa. This should not be thought of as a quid pro quo, or you scratch my back, I scratch your kind of thing. It's not transactional in that way. It becomes much more deeply relational, in the sense that there is a give and take in terms of both us being in right relations with each other and then us being responsible to and for each other. Canada, I don't think, had the same issues we had in the US when COVID was around and people refusing to wear masks, even though science suggested that we should. Well, if I'm in relation with you and I realize that I may be sick, to help you get sick, I put a mask on, whether it infringes on my individual rights or not, because there is a collective sense of relationality and responsibility tied to that. That's one example. And so what you saw in many tribal communities during that time is really a move to begin to care for not just ourselves, but for others in the process. Okay, so I'm going to end on this slide. And for me, if we're going to do this work, if we're going to engage in anti-racist practices, if we're going to make schools places of possibility rather than foreclosure, we need to begin to make the invisible visible. And so there's an encouragement here for you to think about what are the knowledge systems that drive what you do in your daily practices and in your work. What are the things that you do in terms of your relationships to both the content you teach, but also the students that you teach and the place where you live? Can you reimagine how you might do that work? Not understanding the history of this, like sometimes we think, well, this is just how we teach, and it's always been done that way. Well, schooling processes and policies aren't created out of ether. They did not come down off of a mountain on stone tablets. People made them, and so people can actually change them in the process. And then are we willing to consider what kinds of responsibilities we might add to our relationships? And how are we in relation with our students and our content? Is it a relationship over? Is it a relationship through? Is it a relationship with? And are there responsibilities to and for people? And I would argue that if we move knowledge, which is often what schools think of as being purveyors of, um, from a noun to a verb, I actually think it's possible for us to reimagine the work we're doing. So thanks for having me. Looking forward to conversations and questions with you all.
Thank you so much, Bryan. That was amazing. I think basically from my learning, looking at your profound insights, how you started with investigating tribal sovereignty, inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, it resonated deeply. And moving through highlighting treaties and agreements and that reciprocal relationship really to eradicate racism, both locally in order to impact globally, was really impactful. I loved the fact that you said the knowledge systems are literally the air we breathe, just like that, sometime polluted and sometime clean. So I think at this point, what we'll do is we have some really, really great questions that people have asked. Would it be helpful? I can basically copy and paste the question into the chat area, and then you can see it as well. But the first question that we'll have, we're not going to be able to get to all of them, but how can you move beyond token gestures of inclusivity and actively work to dismantle systemic barriers that affect Indigenous students' educational outcomes? It's a big question. Oh, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Yeah, Zoom is new technology apparently, or at least for me it is. Um, I think if we do this work rooted in real relationships that are not transactional and aren't relationships can't be performative. They just can't. And so if we're in relationships and we are in some ways we buy into a particular set of responsibilities that follow that. And so I said in this, or I thought I said and tried to, that if we're doing this in our classroom, so there's this huge thing about dismantling systemic barriers. I think there's some work for some policymakers to do, but I also think in our classrooms we can do some of this. And if there's a bunch of people who buy into it and really engage in those processes, then the school moves and students thrive. And when students thrive in schools, people are like, what's happening in that school? What are the policies? How are you doing this? How are you getting people to actually do, your students to do what you're hoping they will do? What are you learning from them? It begins to drive reform. And so I sort of feel like you have to undo years and years of history that are rooted in assimilation and colonization to actually do the systemic stuff. And I'm beginning to think you start with some small things and you begin to daisy chain and link those together in really thoughtful ways. So you just get the third grade teachers to do it together in your primary school. You get grade 10 to do this, and then you try to get 9 and 11 involved and start to surround it, and you begin to move in those ways. I think there's real hope in that. I also happen to think it's how we train educators, and it's incumbent on those of us who work in and lead schools and faculties of education to say we'll do better about how we're preparing people. We bear a huge amount of responsibility for not for continuing these systematic things. So there's some leadership involved, but I also think we start in our classrooms and we hope from there. Like if you just stop and you think about who was your favorite teacher and why, there are all these lessons for what that means for us. Like Mrs. Santos for me in third grade changed my life. Mrs. Baker in fifth grade changed my life. Those two teachers like are everything for me with my grandmother. And so like for me, I think about Mrs. Santos and Mrs. Baker and all of the things that they kind of helped me figure out both about myself, but also with each other. So as Mary's saying, right? There's teachers who believed in me. It's fundamentally a relational thing to believe in someone else.
Thank you. Very well said. I think this next question, you more or less answered it throughout your entire presentation. How can we ensure that Indigenous students feel valued and respected within the school community beyond just acknowledging historical injustices?
Yeah, look, teachers need to get outside of classrooms. I think all of us do, and understand the local environment where we live and work. And I will always say that the best way to get to know a community is to go to where people are having fun. Like that's where you see people laughing and having fun is where you know it is. It could be at a rodeo, it could be at some swap meet, it could be at a whole bunch of things, but go where people are having fun and laughing. And then go where they're sad and mourning, and you will in some ways it's about showing up to the places where you work and showing up to where students live and being part of that. Like I think that teaching in some ways um becomes something that isn't you clock in and you clock out. If you're going to do this work, you have to show up in different sorts of ways, and some people don't want to do that, some people can't do it. Structurally they can't do it and they get hindered by it, all fair enough. So then make sure students get seen in your classroom by being in relation with them enough to be able to understand what their ways of being are, and then how you take those ways of being and begin to build pedagogical practices from it, and just keep showing up.
Thank you. I think we might have time for one more question. There are lots. I can send them to you after just so that you get a sense of the types of questions that came in. This one regarding teachers who hated school. I'd like to ask, how do we teach our students truly becoming reflective educators who are inclusive, both in mind, heart, and soul?
These are all great questions. Thank you. I think we model it in some ways. Is one of the ways we do that. We invite our students to be curious and we invite them to make mistakes. It drives me crazy that we don't have the capacity for mistakes. Like I remember when Quana, our oldest, was I don't know, he's like this Lego kid. And he was always building more and more elaborate things. And I remember watching him at one point try to get these pieces to fit. And they just wouldn't fit. And I kept waiting for it. And it was a very elaborate thing that he built. I kept waiting for him to like throw it down out of frustration. And he kept breaking it apart and putting it back together and just building and building and building toward this thing that he wanted. And he was making mistakes in the process. But I watched him just kind of work through them. And then 2 years later, he's out with school and like there's no room for him to make mistakes. Like, what does it mean? The power of mistakes becomes so important for us as learning opportunities. So for me, like you become reflective by saying, "Oops, I didn't get this right." Then what might I do? And for us to honor people screwing up. Like I think there's such richness in that, but what we learn in schools is I got to do better, I got to do better, I got to get them all right, I got to get them all right, and that forecloses different ways of kind of imagining what might be possible. So if we want to be critical and we want to be reflective, I think we model it. We engage the world through a sense of of curiosity, and then we invite people to make mistakes and then say like, okay, so what happened here? And then you go from there. I'm always shocked at what happens when people don't get stuff right, and like watching adults like fall apart or watching young people fall apart around it. And I'm like, no one's hurt. Like, you haven't like ruined the world. Like, things will be okay if you make a mistake. And so like I'm great at making mistakes. Like, I'm the best mistake maker I know. The most humble too, but the best mistake maker I know. So I think that's what we do.
I love that. And it's all about that being open to making mistakes. I think what you've taught us here today is the importance of reimagining, recreating, and taking those steps, whether big or small, towards action. And I think the whole idea of relearning and that critical dialogue can happen through those small steps. So we do have our call to action, which is a really, really important part of this series. And I'll just pass it over to Tomika right now, just to remind us about that.
Oops. So when it comes to the availability of impactful, culturally sensitive, and relevant lesson plans that address anti-racism, there are very limited resources available. So we are urging, as a grander gesture, for any interested listeners of today's session to submit a lesson plan that aligns with the content from Dr. Brayboy's presentation in an attempt to create good quality anti-racism resources to put in the hands of educators. This lesson plan call to action is funded by Edith Lando Digital Learning Center that will provide a small grant to make this change. More information can be found on the MET website using the URL provided in the comment area and on the MET website. And I'm going to put it there for everyone.
Thank you so much, Tomika. Another huge thank you to Dr. Bryan Brayboy and to everybody for joining us here today. This was amazing. It's been such a pleasure. It's such an honor that you came to UBC virtually. Maybe next time we can get you to come to the Faculty of Education. I saw that from our Dean Hare here, who, thank you very much for coming. We would love to have you with us in person next time. So thank you so much, Dr. Brayboy, for all of your insights, your knowledge, and sharing your own expertise and your own passion for everything you do.
Thank you. And
Thank
thanks
you so
for
much.
UBC being so amazing. I love y'all. It's a great place. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a wonderful evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us.